ultimately, these all made me realize that sort of the neat categories that we talk about at the high level in things like CDFIs, et cetera, about community development and the people who we will engage with they're not as neat when you get into a neighborhood level and you realize this is a community with a wide range of people who bring their own gifts and stories. And our job is to facilitate them being able to access the resources to carry out their dreams and not my dreams.
Welcome to More Than Profit, the podcast where values, vision, and capital converge. Produced by Access Ventures, this show spotlights the leaders and innovators redefining success, not just through financial returns, but by the impact they create. Every episode dives into the inspiring stories, bold ideas, and hard-won lessons of those who are leveraging capital, financial, intellectual, and social for equity, sustainability, and systematic change. Whether you're an investor, entrepreneur, or purpose-driven professional, we are here to challenge the status quo, push the boundaries of traditional investing, and inspire you to align your resources with your values. Join us as we explore how capital can be a force for meaningful change.
In neighborhoods across the country, systemic barriers, i.e. entrenched poverty, underinvestment, and inequitable access to resources, paint a bleak picture for millions. Community development has long been heralded as the answer, but the reality is far more complex. Beyond well-meaning initiatives and flashy projects lies a system riddled with inefficiencies and deeply rooted inequities. True transformation requires a seismic shift, not just in funding, but in the way that we understand and approach the systems that shape our lives. Today, I sit down with Bill Taft, Senior Vice President of Economic Development at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, otherwise known as LISC. Bill's journey began in the shadows of these same struggles, growing up in a community where limited opportunities shaped daily life. Those formative years instilled in him a deep understanding of the forces that hold communities back and a relentless drive to address them. Over decades, Bill has moved from grassroots activism to a leadership role at one of the most impactful organizations in community development, helping to channel billions of dollars into underserved areas. But this isn't a story of easy solutions or clear victories. Bill challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems we've inherited and the uneven progress that we've made. He'll share what it really takes to move beyond symbolic gestures towards structural change, and why even the most well-intentioned efforts often fall short. This conversation doesn't offer simple answers or neat conclusions. Instead, it's an invitation to wrestle with the complexity of community development and question how much that we're truly willing to commit to systemic transformation. Let's begin. Well, Bill, thanks for being on the podcast today. We have a fantastic guest. I met Bill actually just about a month ago in Nashville, Tennessee at the Hope Summit at Belmont University. But I followed his work for a while. I was the one that was supposed to be leading a table on community-based strategies and investing. And I turned to my left and I'm like, Bill Taft should be leading this table on community-based strategies and investing. And so it was a pleasure to meet you there, Bill. And let's start off. First off, I mean, a lot of people that aren't familiar with LISC may not be familiar with your work, but you've been in the space of community development, strategy, creative finance for the better part of 30 plus years. So talk to us a little bit about your current role and kind of what you do at LISC these days.
Well, first of all, Bryce, thanks for having me. I appreciate the chance to have this conversation, and I've definitely enjoyed learning more about your work and its impact particularly in the Louisville area. And living in Indianapolis, we're kind of neighbors, so
we're not too far.
So I've been working in community development for really over 30 years, as you said, and kind of had a very small number of jobs, but a lot of different roles. I've worked for my current organization, Local Initiative Support Corporation, for almost 20 years, and was the director of our Indianapolis office. It's a national nonprofit. It's the largest community development financial institution. But what's interesting to me about it is that it is very localized in the way it deploys. And so we have 38 cities where we have local offices. And in each of those, these are tier 1, tier 2 cities mostly. And then we also have a rural network in almost every state. And we deploy through local offices that have staff that are from that community and are really embedded in long-term relationships with community-based organizations doing community development work in historically disinvested neighborhoods. And then most recently, for the last 6 years, I've been leading our national economic development strategy, just basically pushing LISC to more effectively move into the economic development space through our lending, through our local partnerships and strategies, as well as national partnerships. And really all this work is kind of based on what I learned doing community-based work for about 16 years before that, before coming to LISC. And most of that time I was running a community development corporation in the Fountain Square neighborhood of Indianapolis and doing a range of things with a neighborhood-based board, doing affordable housing development, commercial revitalization in an older commercial district. We started a charter school. We built a health center. So a wide range of activities, great education for just learning a whole bunch of things through that. And this work at LISC has been built on that.
That's great. So talk to me, like one of the things that I think is interesting, especially in the last 20, 30 years, there's been this hyper consolidation of banks. So we've got fewer and fewer community banks around America and more big banks like JP Morgan and others. And in fact, it makes it really tough if you're a bank of less than $10 billion in assets to really do work. And a lot of people look at that as a good thing. They look at that as like, oh, it's greater efficiency. We're a global economy. But then you have these things like LISC, and you talk about like these smaller community-based organizations. Why do you think that matters, especially right now in our current landscape of finance and access to capital? I mean, I personally feel like this hyper consolidation is not necessarily a good thing for local communities. So how do you guys think about that and speak to that?
We certainly have partnered for many years with a lot of those larger banks because LISC is national and our headquarters is in New York City. I mean, from the beginning, we were designed to work with banks.
Correct, yeah.
To be a place where banks could pool capital and invest in communities, but in ways that were more, I guess you'd say, localized through our network. And so, we have worked to bridge that difference, I would say, between these large national institutions and the particular challenges and opportunities of local neighborhoods and the businesses in those neighborhoods. But clearly, there needs to be more of that kind of bridging. And we even now work a lot with smaller CDFIs that are able to do some of the more very localized, specific things that need to be done in a particular community that sometimes we aren't a great fit for because we're large and national. So it's an interesting dynamic of both in the CDFI world, but also in banking, there's some of those same dynamics. And we try to, I guess, counter that through this network that's very localized. And obviously banks try to do that too, but I think it's harder. And certainly when you get into the world of real estate and small business finance, those regional banks and smaller banks are really very critical still, as are those sort of smaller CDFIs that work at the local level.
Yeah, and you talked a lot about that and some of the things that I've seen with there's just the power of partnership, the importance of kind of the local flavor. I mean, for one, they are known in the communities. They know the cultures of the community, they know the people of the community, so they have the credibility to do the work. And so it's kind of that one of those interesting things that's really hard. It's like, oh, let's have the banks do it, and that's what kind of everybody. But then it's like, then people have a negative reaction that it's these small community organizations, but then they have a hard time raising capital, or words I've heard in the philanthropic space around capital absorption, like they couldn't take that large check and put it to work as effectively or as quickly as the partners need. And so you guys play that interesting role of an intermediary where you can go and work with the federal government and understand, okay, what are you trying to do in these communities across the country? And then you can turn around and through your channel of partnerships and relationships effectively deploy that capital to meet the needs of communities. So I think sometimes people don't understand how complex that is. They just kind of like to throw the darts at the board and say, hey, give us more money. The people with the money are like, well, what are you going to do with $1 billion? It's like, how are you going to turn around and effectively do that? And so I think that's one of the things that I've always appreciated about organizations like LISC and just even you thinking differently about partnership and the need for blended capital to meet the needs of communities. Could you give me an example? When I say blended capital, this idea of kind of public-private partnership, what's a great example in your work that you've seen that be effectively deployed?
Yeah. So, I mean, the most common thing that LISC invests in is affordable housing, but
Hmm.
also other kinds of commercial real estate. It typically in disinvested neighborhoods, mostly urban neighborhoods, but also in a rural network, as I said. And when you look at any of those projects, there's typically 4 to 12 different sources of capital in that project. And so they can get extremely complex. And ultimately, it's because of a combination of pursuing affordability,
Hmm.
so bringing down the cost of the end buyer or tenant in that space to make it affordable, but also often because of market failure, where you've got neighborhoods where the values just aren't going to be there, even if you build or renovate a building fully, it's still going to be worth less than you have to spend on it. So
Mm.
you've got to layer in subsidies of subsidy for both affordability and market failure. And those things are especially in Midwestern cities, sort of post-industrial places where values just have never recovered. Those you usually have to do both. And that's been
Mm.
my experience mostly in the places projects I've worked on. And so you end up with organizations like LISC that can do things like syndicate low income housing tax credits and put together pools of capital to what we call purchase. It's not really purchasing, but they could become a partner in a project to utilize an award of low income housing tax credits and affordable rental project, for example. But also, there's new markets tax credits, which is another way for more commercial projects that the federal government indirectly subsidizes projects, but requires somebody like LISC to bring capital in to utilize those credits. But then there's the traditional sort of layer of debt. And below that, there's usually a need for more debt than, because of the appraisal gap that I mentioned, that so often will be a secondary, a subordinate lender on a project. Then you'll find local government putting funds into that as well and sometimes those are through tax abatement, sometimes it's through federal dollars that are being passed through the city. So it's a kind of a mind-boggling blend of
Yeah.
incentives that go into these projects to make them work. And there's also, when you start, I would say that's most refined in the world of real estate and real estate development. We've had sort of the longest runway to do that, et cetera. But there's definitely becoming more of that in the small business finance space as well. And so, yeah, there's a lot of capital that's flowing into green development, which will
Mm.
just be another layer that we put into this as well.
That's very complex. I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm like, I know you got a degree in history. You have a master's in architectural planning. You've been in this work for 30 years, but I'm also thinking about many of the people that I know in community development that just get into it because they have a passion for people and place. And then all of a sudden they have to turn around and get a PhD in, in creative finance just to even make the projects work. How did you, for one, being from outside Chicago, being in Indianapolis now for over 30 years, how did you get into this work? Like what were the drivers in your earlier life that pushed you down this path of community and place and really diving in? Because to my knowledge, I think you and your wife still live in the same neighborhood that you moved into in the 1990s in Indianapolis. So like, what gives a guy like that the passion to do it? It's hard work for that long too.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the two things. One is I grew up with a father who loved history and historic places and visiting them. So he dragged us around to a whole bunch of older neighborhoods and many historic sites around cities of America. And many of those were in places where there was a lot of disinvestment around them. And it was just kind of fascinating. As a kid, I remember visiting places in Philadelphia and seeing like the historic sites, but also the neighborhoods around them and just kind of experiencing that. And certainly just growing up on the edge of Chicago. And what the time period I grew up in was the late 70s, early 80s. And that was kind of that bridge between the boom of industrial America and the bust of industrial America.
Mhm.
And seeing a lot of kids I grew up with, their fathers worked in the steel mills. and made really good money. They had a boat. They had maybe had a vacation home, and so they had. And my dad was an engineer, but they had things that we didn't have. And their dad had not gone to school beyond high school, and they expected to go in and start pushing a broom right after high school graduation and being in the union and making good money and continuing the way their fathers had lived. And suddenly all that fell apart. Late 70s, early 80s. And I remember when I was in college looking for a job for the summer, I couldn't find a summer job because what had been historically summer jobs had all been taken by laid off steel workers and other people who had lost good quality jobs. And so seeing what that did to my hometown, which is Michigan City, Indiana, and what it did to the area around us, I think really just had a big impression on me and gave me a heart for particularly these Rust Belt places, disinvested places where there had been great opportunity there. And then that opportunity went away and left behind a lot of damaged people, a lot of damaged places, and a need to kind of rebuild an economy, an opportunity in those places. And so I think those two things sort of came together at the neighborhood level, because I would say it's hard to think about fixing systems at the system level. And I've been part of those efforts, and it's really difficult and frustrating. But when you get down to a neighborhood level and say, okay, as a community, can we work together to do something here and now in this particular set of properties or with these particular small businesses, you can find common ground and you can find pragmatic solutions at that level. And I think I have hope that eventually that trickles up and systems get better at having those kinds of outcomes if you can actually demonstrate them in concrete ways for the benefit of a specific neighborhood. And I think that sort of pragmatic, sort of Midwestern pragmatism is sort of the other part of it.
Yeah. Okay, so that's helpful. Then you fast forward, you're in Indianapolis, you're living in a community doing the work. Do you have a story of like how you learned to approach this work with a certain level of empathy and pace, recognizing that, I think especially as a young person jumping into community development work, there's this sense of urgency and we need to do things now. Change needs to happen now. But oftentimes it doesn't just happen as fast as we want. And oftentimes if it happens too quickly, it has the negative effect of gentrification and other things. So how did you learn those things? Were there people that, as you kind of got into it that, mentored you in that? Or was there a negative situation where you're like, oh, okay, I don't want to do that again? What was it that helped you understand the empathy and the pace and the challenges that these communities were facing?
Yeah, I would say making a lot of mistakes has probably been my greatest teacher, is my own mistakes. I started as a Main Street manager in a small town, Richmond, Indiana. I did that just for a couple of years before becoming a CDC director in Indianapolis. And I showed up for my first board meeting with that board, and half the board was like, well, who are you? Why are you here? That committee wasn't authorized to hire anybody. And so I dropped into this dying downtown where my job was a lot of the small business owners were like, your job is to bring my cash register. So what are you doing to make that happen? And suddenly I had to learn about what's the life of these small entrepreneurs that have maybe our second or even sometimes third generation small business owners in this downtown. And they're struggling and they're not that excited about the things I'm excited about as far as urban design and the larger strategies of downtown revitalization in a small town. And so that was a rude awakening for me to learn to okay, well, my job is to do what this community needs, not what I'm interested in. And so organizing the holiday parade, putting on special promotional events to drive people down for Labor Day sales, things I had no experience or particular interest in, I just had to do because it's the right thing to do for that particular community. And so I didn't last a real long time in that job because organizing holiday parades is not my gift, but it certainly was, that was my first step. And then when I started as a director of a small CDC with 2 employees in the urban neighborhood of Fountain Square, this was a neighborhood that was a historically Appalachian neighborhood, one of the lowest income, lowest education level, lowest voter turnout rate in the state of Indiana. But also it was a different kind of poverty than people usually think of as urban poverty because of that Appalachian history. So I didn't know anything about that. I was from outside Chicago. That's culturally very different. And so I just had to make a lot of mistakes and be frustrated a lot because people didn't respond the way I expected them to, and realizing that I was the outsider and, this was, I need to learn to work within that culture. And a lot of that, I had board members that were super helpful that were from the neighborhood. And I just interacting with individuals that we were selling houses to, or contractors that were working for us who were really from the community too. It was a amazing learning experience. And then at the same time, putting together larger projects that were complex, using tax credits, using layers of financing. At the same time, I was doing that was a really stretching experience.
What does it take to turn an idea into a thriving business? For many entrepreneurs, the hardest hurdle is securing their first dollar of funding, a crucial milestone that can make or break a venture. That's where Access Ventures' groundbreaking First Dollar program comes in. Over the past 4 years, this program has been more than just a funding initiative. It's been a catalyst for change. By providing entrepreneurs with the capital they need to get started, it's enabled dozens of startups to cross the critical threshold from concept to execution. Now, Access Ventures is sharing the lessons learned in an in-depth case study that examines the program's impact and highlights the strategies that worked and challenges that remain. If you're an entrepreneur, investor, or changemaker interested in how target funding can drive economic growth and equity, this is a must-read. Explore the real-world successes, hear the stories of founders who've benefited, and discover insights that could transform the way we think about the early-stage funding. Visit accessventures.org to dive into the First Dollar case study and see how Access Ventures is reshaping what it means to empower entrepreneurs. Don't miss this chance to learn from projects that's redefining access to capital. Check it out today.
I recently read an article you wrote about the value of these small local CDCs, and because they get the people. And sometimes in our work, people will talk about like people of peace. Like in these neighborhoods, there's someone that's probably not maybe even the largest business owner in that community, but they are a person of influence. Everybody knows them. They kind of can help keep the peace in a sense. And they also are the ones that know where everybody is and that have just an unbelievable influence. So how did you go about, like in Fountain Square or later in Inglewood or other communities you worked in, how did you go about finding those people? And was it just sitting on their porch and drinking some coffee and connecting with them at a human level? What did that look like in your work?
Yeah, once you're working at the neighborhood level, you're part of sort of this network of people who care enough to give their time and to show up, and so whether it's the neighborhood association or the crime watch or a public hearing for some event, some investment that somebody wants to make, you just meet the folks through that. And I think about Donna, who lived in the neighborhood a long time. She bought one of the first houses our CDC had ever rehabbed long before I got there, when it was very poorly run and had a terrible experience. So she started out with kind of an attitude about our organization when I met her, which was fairly common when I met people. And so just listening to her and how that had affected her, and yet how she'd been faithful in her block and getting to know neighbors, and she cleaned houses for a living. But also the whole time she cleaned houses, she listened to NPR, was extremely well informed about what was going on. And in the end, she ended up being my board chair for a couple of years and did a great job of representing the community in front of the mayor and a variety of things like that, where she was able to say, this is the reality of the people who live in this community, but also we understand how we fit into the bigger picture. And it was just exciting to work with people like that. There was another guy named Linton, who his dad had been the neighborhood barber, and he went away into the Navy and came back and he knew how to cut hair too. He'd been a barber in the Navy, and he started like beauty colleges when those were kind of growing, and he would rehab old gas stations and he was kind of handy and could stretch a buck. And in the end, I ended up meeting him when he was trying to buy the biggest building in our commercial district, which had been a mix of offices and theaters and bowling alleys, and very large old great historic building, but was vacant.
Hmm.
And so working with him through the years, I helped him on the financing side. He helped me on like, how do you get things done sort of in the non-linear way that you have to get projects like that done. And he hired a lot of neighborhood people, and he was a little bit more rough around the edges in the sense of how he worked with people who worked for him than I was comfortable with. But I also saw, okay, well, why is it like that? And
Hmm.
anyhow, I mean, I could go on about with stories, but ultimately these all made me realize that sort of the neat categories that we talk about at the high level and things like CDFIs, et cetera, about community development, and the people who we will engage with they're not as neat when you get into a neighborhood level and you realize this is a community with a wide range of people who bring their own gifts and stories, and our job is to facilitate them being able to access the resources to carry out their dreams and not my dreams.
Hmm. That's a good point. Their dreams, not your dreams, because I think these are complex financial structures, real estate, business, layered on top of very complex people and places. A lot of history of being let down, promised something and it's never followed through. And so then you come in with a heart to desire to change things, but a lot of skepticism that comes from years of people not doing what they said they were going to do. So how did you stay in the work for so long? Like, I'm thinking about young people that get in and they're excited and passionate, and more often than not, after a couple of years, I just see them get frustrated and lose heart. How did you maintain a sense of presence and personal peace in order to kind of stick in the work as you're kind of having these conversations? Was there anything in you that, were there moments where like, okay, screw this, I'm going to go do something else? How did you do that? I'm just like, so it's so impressive to hear, to talk with you about 30 plus years of doing that work. And it's hard. It's really hard.
I mean, it was definitely moments that were very difficult. And I do remember like literally days driving past a construction crew that was maybe like digging on the side of the road for utility work and thinking, I think I'd rather do that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in most businesses too, if you don't like your boss and you're in graphics design, you just go somewhere else and you do graphics design. And you're in community work, that part doesn't change. It doesn't matter where you go. You're dealing with
Yeah,
people and
that's right.
complex emotions.
Yeah, I think that ultimately what carried me through this was a strong belief in the importance of communities, and particularly the particular need of disinvested urban places to change, but that the way that change needed to come was from within those neighborhoods, and that I, for whatever reason, was put here, and this is something that I have some skills that seem to be able to navigate, and this is a calling. And so we
Mm.
lived in a neighborhood that was very disinvested when we moved in. We were part of planting a church just a few blocks away in a building that was vacant very deteriorated. My wife was part of starting 2 schools that ended up being the schools that my kids attended, and in buildings that were vacant. And so it's been a life of great reward
Mm.
for our family. I'm just really thankful for it. And the relationships we've had, the sense of like, this is where we're supposed to be. And then to see my kids, who are now all successfully adulting, as I like to say, but they are doing similar things. And 2 of them live here in Indy and about a mile from us, and both have rehabbed houses and are working in economic and community development kind of work. I have a daughter who
Wow.
lives in New York who's kind of the rogue one, but she's doing affordable housing development in New York City. So it's kind of a family calling, and
Mm.
it gives a great sense of unity and purpose. And so it's been great, but definitely not always easy. And it's definitely, we always feel like we're kind of pushing against the system, that the system's wired against this work and that somebody needs to do it. And it's kind of fun being sort of the rogue folks pushing against the way things normally flow. I think we kind of enjoy that sort of self-image of like being the
Yeah.
fighters for urban America, which is,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm curious, as I listen to you talk, like with 30 plus years of experience, and I'm curious how you interview people for jobs these days? Like what kind of questions, knowing kind of the difficulty of the work and the need to kind of sit and be still and listen to folks and just kind of hear their voices as you do the work in communities. How do you discern that, so to speak, in another person? What kind of questions would you ask someone if they're wanting to get into this work?
That's a great question. I think the personal story and like why they're interested and where they come from is certainly really important. Motivation is critical. I would say, obviously, there's kind of a pragmatic technical skill side too, of like, just what have they ever gotten done that's maybe small, but there's a certain level of grit of like, we're just going to get this thing done, even if it's not going the way we wanted it to. That is part of this work. And I think certainly patience is part of it, but I guess a balance with also some ambition too, because ultimately it's very easy to sort of become resigned to the way things work normally. And so having some kind of drive that's like a sense, and often that comes from like a sense of this is not the way the world was meant to be. And I feel called to be part of changing that. Is certainly some of the best people I know in community development, they're coming from that framework.
Yeah, I like that. So what do you think about when you look at the future, kind of in your new role, which it seems like a relatively new emphasis at LISC, this idea of economic development. And obviously you guys have done that for a long time, but what do you envision as kind of the next frontier for community development? And as we kind of look at, technology's changed, the global financial markets have changed drastically a couple of times. Even in the last 10 years, we've had some interesting moments within the housing bubbles, and right now the prices of housing. So what do you envision as the kind of the next frontier of community development? What gets you excited about tomorrow and tomorrow's work?
Right now, I feel like there's a convergence happening between community development and economic development. And when I first got into this field, they called it community economic development, but essentially their community development and economic development historically were very different sort of sectors. For whatever reason, I've always been one of the folks that in community development world was more crossed that line and was involved around economic development for a variety of reasons in Indianapolis that made sense for LISC to be in that space here. And it taught me a lot about that some of the challenges, and increasingly this is true for economic development professionals, is that what they're being asked to do is beyond the traditional role of economic development. So this idea, traditionally economic development has helped businesses expand or relocate, incentivize them to invest in a particular community, to expand their investment there, hire more people, ultimately create jobs. And that framework is still largely what economic development folks get paid to do. But what they have found is in many places, especially like urban neighborhoods or small towns or even smaller cities, they're really having a hard time competing for a variety of reasons. One is just quality of life. Capital is going to places where people choose to live and invest, and tends to be the coasts or really large cities. And that's bad news for a lot of places in the Midwest in particular, or smaller communities. And so economic development people are struggling. Well, what do we do about that? And the other issue is workforce. You can attract new businesses to a town and then not have enough workers, and businesses know that too. And so I think there's a couple of the challenges are, how do you make a place that's more attractive for people to choose to live and invest? And then some of that goes back to how do we support an ecosystem of entrepreneurs? They're going to offer goods and services that are important for a community. And then how do we help the current residents of a community have the skills to actually fill the jobs and the demands of jobs that are out there that could grow in that community but aren't now? And all of those things are really community development, not traditional economic development. So there is a great need right now for us to bridge across the worlds of community and economic development and learn from the history of doing this kind of work that community development has, but bring the money and the political clout of the economic development world together with that to actually really ramp that up and apply it in places where it hasn't been applied in the past. So another sort of key element that's being talked about is just the housing shortage in so many places. Well, community development's been building housing for a long time. We just haven't had enough money to build enough of them.
Right.
Economic development has never been involved with housing. They're like, well, if we bring jobs, housing will come.
Right.
And we've realized that's just not how it works. And so we've got to have housing for jobs to come. And, or there's got to be the right quality and price point of housing for people to be able to stay in a community or choose to live there. So,
yeah. Or it's transportation.
Those things are all coming together.
Yeah. And it's economic development folks or just businesses at large saying, oh, wait a minute. We have housing, but the housing's not located where our businesses are. So maybe it's a transportation issue or a lot of single parents and early childhood education or after school programming or businesses that are relocating or looking to relocate. And they're now having to think through, okay, well, where are my families that I move here going to send their kids to school? What's the public school system like? So how is the school infrastructure? Like that old school quote unquote community development stuff is, oh, wait a minute. Now that actually does directly impact my bottom line of business.
Right. Yeah.
So
comprehensive community development is what we've called it in the past. And ultimately that's what communities need in order to be economically competitive.
Comprehensive community development. I like that. Well, that's exciting work. How do you, I guess one of my final questions real quick as we close up would just be, how have you found the businesses receptive? Are they receptive? Has that been a hard thing to get chambers of commerce and business communities at the table? Or are they, because their bottom line has been so impacted through these things, they're there and they're ready? Has that been a difficult conversation, or is that something where you're seeing more and more acceptance?
I think clearly businesses and chambers recognize that this change is afoot and that they need to adapt how they work. The how is difficult sometimes. I think at the large scale chamber of commerce, local economic development group, they can acknowledge that they need a more comprehensive approach and improving quality of life, et cetera. But the how is very difficult for them. If they just don't have, I kind of talk about how they have like T-Rex arms. They're big and they have resources, but they can't actually touch the things they need to move. And so it's helping them understand the value of partnerships with groups maybe they just haven't really had a relationship with or really respected even in the past.
Mm.
And also, it's building trust across those lines of at the large scale organizations, sort of mainstream business leader types and community-based groups where often they haven't worked together, and because of that, they don't really trust each other either. So I think that's a key activity that needs to happen. And usually that's around working on things together. It's finding common ground. Let's work together. Let's build trust. Let's build capacities to work together. That's important. And then as far as businesses go, entrepreneurs are very focused on their particular bottom line and what has to happen for them to make a profit. And sometimes, what I learned when I was a Main Street manager is they don't really care what's outside of that particular range without a lot of trust building and also just a lot of conversations for them to ultimately the light bulb to go on of like, oh, I'm part of something bigger and my success is tied to that. And maybe there's some things that I can do differently to both benefit the community, but also to gain benefit as well. And that's just and often that's connecting them to technical assistance for their business, as well as access to capital. And that goes back to our early part of our conversation about like, where does that access come from? And I think that's a huge lift, is helping entrepreneurs grow in the places where historically there's been disinvestment, where there's a need for those small businesses to be playing a key role in improving the quality of life by offering goods and services and jobs where they're most needed. And so creating an ecosystem that supports that is really the big challenge.
Yeah. It's a beautiful picture. I hope we can get there. I'm sure we can.
Encouraging, there are places where it's happening. That's what keeps me going, is just seeing how it has happened in certain places and just how do we spread that?
Yeah, that's true. Very true. Well, Bill, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. Today's conversation with Bill urged us to reconsider the connection between economic development and community development. Bill's decades of experience reveal that these two concepts are not just related, they're inseparably intertwined. True progress emerges when we view economic development as more than just investments in infrastructure or businesses. It's about investing in people, in neighborhoods, and in systems that enable entire communities to thrive. From his early work in struggling neighborhoods to his leadership at LISC, Bill has demonstrated how we can move beyond isolated initiatives towards holistic strategies that address systemic barriers. However, this journey is far from straightforward. Achieving equity and sustainability requires navigating a complex, often resistant path, one that demands perseverance and a willingness to confront hard truths. As we reflect on this discussion, one essential insight stands out. Community development is economic development. Addressing one without the other leaves progress incomplete. Lasting change requires us to embrace their inseparability and champion solutions that uplift both people and the systems they depend on.
Thanks for tuning in to More Than Profit, a podcast produced by Access Ventures. We hope today's conversation inspired you to think differently about how values, vision, and capital can create meaningful change. To stay up to date, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, we'd love if you left a review to help others find the show. Visit us at accessventures.org/podcast for additional content and past episodes. You can also join the conversation by following us on Twitter at ACS Ventures. Today's episode of More Than Profit was hosted by Bryce Butler. Our executive producer is Crystal Esquivel, and our associate producers are Bryn McKay and Bailey Pendleton. Audio production assistance is provided by Resonate Recording. Graphics are by Justin Esquivel. Today's theme music is Daniel Jorgensen. I'm Bryn McKay, and you've been listening to More Than Profit, a production of Access Ventures. See you next time.